A lot of games get sequels, it's only natural. After all, it allows for the continuation of a story, a chance to refine gameplay, and the developers can guarantee sales from fans of the original. But all too often, sequels aren't actually everything they're hyped up to be. Since game development is a business, and businesses want to make money, sequels often tend to come about not for creative or artistic reasons, but for financial ones. And while I don't fault them for wanting money, I do see a lot of missed potential everywhere I look. But there is one game that I've been playing recently that left me pleasantly surprised. Hand of Fate 2. I really enjoy the original game and put my fair share of hours into it. Hell, I currently hold the speedrun world record for the any percent category of Hand of Fate. But I have to say, Hand of Fate 2 is the perfect sequel. Now let me be clear, I'm not saying that Hand of Fate 2 is a perfect game by any means, it certainly has its flaws. But it's a fantastic sequel and actually made an effort to build off the first game and to become bigger and better. So what is it that makes a good sequel? What should developers be aiming for? Well, I think the most obvious thing is gameplay. Typically speaking, unless some other element of the original is so amazing as to take over the experience, there's usually something about the gameplay that resonates with players. So developers should take this gameplay loop and keep that thing that the players like while smoothing the edges, fixing any problems, and adding new and interesting things that the player can learn and play around with. Next is balance. When a developer makes a game, there may well be some issues with how everything interacts. Some of that can be fixed by tweaking a couple numbers or adding something new in a patch, but some require changing the fundamentals of the game, which is usually not viable for a game post-release. Well, with a sequel, you have the opportunity to revisit your idea at its core and make those decisions as you're building up the sequel. Furthermore, there will likely be technical advancements that'll help with certain issues that may have been out of your control. For example, the early Pokemon games had their game size limited by the cartridges themselves, and the developers had to use clever workarounds that produced a functional game, but made bugs far more common and allows for players to completely break everything. Nowadays, this isn't really that much of an issue for them. Game Freak still obviously wants to limit the game size as much as possible, but they don't have that hard limit that they did back in the 90s. And the third thing a sequel needs is something new. Some sequels end up just feeling like more of the original game, and honestly, I feel like they'd fit more as DLC. While this usually results in a decent enough game, it's definitely a missed opportunity. And also, some players may grow bored if there's nothing new to spice things up. So let's bring it back to Hand of Fate 2 and why I think Defiant just nailed it. Hand of Fate was one of the earliest examples of a deck-building roguelike. Sort of. It's not quite the same as what you'd probably expect. Instead of playing a card game like Slay the Spire, the cards you unlock are used to make up the spaces on the map and to determine your supplies and equipment. The encounters themselves play out like a choose-your-own-adventure book where you can get different outcomes based on your choices. There's also a mini-game where you can follow a shuffling set of 4 cards to determine the outcome of the encounter. In some encounters, you'll enter combat, which is basically a third-person brawler. The primary method of unlocking new cards is by obtaining tokens, which are given as reward for completing certain encounters with a favorable outcome. At the end of your run, success or failure, you unlock new things based on the tokens you've obtained. As innovative as the game is, it's all pretty straightforward. Well, on a gameplay level, Hand of Fate 2 really cleaned everything up while keeping everything that I loved about the original. The combat shifted from what kind of felt like an inferior version of the Arkham games to a more heavy and methodical system that was similar but better fit what the game was going for. The weapon system was also reworked so the player can now have 3 different weapon classes: dual wielding, one-handed, and two-handed. They all have a distinct feel, and certain enemies are designed to be more effective against certain styles. For example, thieves have a chance to dodge attacks, so the high attack speed of dual wielding is what you want. And the Empire soldiers have armor that gives a flat damage reduction per hit, so the high damage per hit of two-handed weapons is the best choice there. This adds a lot of variety and strategy to the game, and it also solves a problem in the first game where there were a few weapons that were just completely better than others, particularly some of the late game weapons. In Hand of Fate 2, you'll actually want to switch things up even when one weapon seems better on paper. And on top of that, they added 3 new minigames. In addition to the card shuffle, there's a Yahtzee-style dice minigame, a pendulum that tests your timing, and a spinning wheel. There's just so much more to play around with, and many of the encounters feel completely different based on which minigames you play. They also added a whole bunch of new enemies and reworked the ones that stuck around from the first game. One example of this I noticed was that they removed one of the more annoying enemies from the original, the Ratmen. However, they moved a lot of their mechanics to some of the new enemies. When Ratmen died, they left a cloud of poison, which was more annoying than anything. In Hand of Fate 2, that idea was given to the Briar Folk, who will shortly explode after dying, which just feels more fair. And of course, that's not the only example of this, far from it. I could probably spend an hour just going over the new things they added and the stuff they improved on the original just in terms of enemies. The next big thing I want to touch on is how they handled the campaign. In the original game, each level was your standard random map with a predetermined number of stages, and you start out with a specific modifier. It works, but in hindsight it does feel a little bland at times. In Hand of Fate 2, the stage is basically custom designed around its objective. Of course, you'll still have random encounters that you get with your deck building, but most stages will be littered with cards put in by the game to give the level a certain playstyle, and some are even given a predetermined layout that you have to work with. Additionally, each stage has a unique objective as opposed to the original game, where the goal was always just kill the boss. For example, in one stage, you have to do everything in your power to raise your maximum health enough to survive the poison of an assassin who's trying to kill you. In another, you'll have to rescue civilians from an enemy type called the Corrupted, which are basically zombies. Yet another had a really interesting take on the Fame mechanic, which was another new addition to Hand of Fate 2. Fame is almost universally a good thing. High Fame is a requirement for certain equipment, and some encounters will do a Fame check. However, in this stage, you encounter enemy patrols and you have to sneak past them. Well, if you have high fame, the card shuffle becomes much more difficult and you're roped into combat if you fail. And of course, many of the cards you encounter on your way will increase your fame as a punishment rather than as a reward, which really turns things on its head. It's really cool, and each individual stage in Hand of Fate 2 really stands out in a way that the original game didn't. I mean, I could tell you what each boss from the first game does, but not what the stage modifiers are. And the last big thing I want to talk about is Endless Mode. Both games have an Endless Mode where you can really test yourself. Everything you've unlocked will feature, and you have to do your best to rack up points. The original game's Endless Mode, while fun, was horribly imbalanced and frustrating at times. See, many of the encounters and items were balanced more for story mode than endless. Furthermore, the difficulty curve was all kinds of fucked. It starts out easy, gets really easy once you get some good equipment, and eventually you reach a point where you just kinda coast, until the game's difficulty modifiers, for lack of a better term, decide to slap you down. As is to be expected, the longer the game goes on, you get less of the things that you want, such as gold and food, and when you get hurt more. Well, eventually, the game gets to a point where they start throwing things at you, and it's literally unbeatable if RNG screws you. You might take a 50% life point damage card from an encounter, followed by a series of life point damage cards in the next stage that will kill you outright with zero chance of avoidance or counterplay. Eventually, the game just decides, nope, you die now. And that's a shame. Hand of Fate 2 takes an entirely different approach. It works as an endless series of bosses. You pick one of two choices, each worth a different number of points. You can also choose up to 3 optional objectives which will reward you with in-game boosts and points. From there, you draft your encounter and equipment decks, kind of like Hearthstone's arena mode. This continues ad infinitum with everything getting tougher as you go. The optional objectives on their own are pretty neat. Sometimes they'll do things like force you to pay a food or gold cost, which balances out the large number of both that a skilled player can acquire. Or maybe you'll be told to have a certain number of curses, which on their own will increase difficulty. And the mode is actually truly designed around being endless. There's a mechanic in Endless Mode called the Ravages of Time. This makes it so your fame decays, damage can lower your maximum health down to 100, and your equipment degrades in combat, losing armor and damage over time. This means that you can't just coast on a strong early game, and you can't find that one OP weapon that you love and use it forever. Eventually, it will be garbage, and you'll have to switch to whatever else you have. It's a really cool mechanic, and it makes me constantly switch up my loadout, and it often makes me weigh the consequences of using certain gear. There are times when I really like the passive effect on a piece of headgear, so I'll keep it on, despite it having degraded down to a 0 armor bonus. And they also added encounters that can let you gain curses or sacrifice blessings or equipment for points. Basically adding another layer of risk versus, well, not even an in-game reward, just more points. Endless Mode was one of my biggest complaints about the first game, and one that I've seen even the developers agree with. I have to say that they absolutely blew it out of the water with Hand of Fate 2's Endless Mode. It's phenomenal. Now, I could go on and on about this game, but I think I've made my point. It's not a perfect game, but Hand of Fate 2 is one of the best examples of how I think sequels should be done. It took what I loved about the original, improved it, and added more on top of everything. It really shows that Defiant cared about their games, and it's a damn shame that they're no longer in business. If you ever get the chance, I'd highly recommend trying out Hand of Fate 2. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. I upload every Monday, so make sure to check back in next week. Follow me on Twitter at AdsTweets for updates and memes, and follow me on Twitch at AdsGames, where I'll be streaming regularly once work calms down. Well, with all that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back.